The beautiful Belgian GP provided yet another amazing race in 2024. The race had it all: strategy, overtakes, tough but very fair defending, and even a disqualification which nobody expected, and we got pretty much about an hour later when George Russell's car was weighted. I will talk more about this towards the end of our race review, and showed off what this brilliant track can do when all the cars are close. I mean, the pace between literally P1 to P4 in the constructors was about 2/10 from Ferrari to Mercedes. It was so close between the top four, so that gave us amazing results, and at the very end, it was only a 1-second finish amongst the three drivers. Let's talk about the race in general, starting from Friday, because that's where Mercedes really made a change that was necessary for the car. Right before getting into it, I wanted to thank you guys for the support on the channel. It's been amazing. We're getting into this now summer break, and I would love if the new people here would subscribe. It would mean a lot to my channel and push me even further. But let's get started with the race review of the Belgian GP. As I said, everything started with Friday with Mercedes. The car was nowhere, the window they had was terrible for Spa, and they were having the same problems that Ferrari was actually having in the previous GPs, which was the bouncing and porpoising. The car brought a significant upgrade to the floor, which made the floor edge look very similar to that of the RB20. This was meant to give them a little bit more of that downforce that they needed. They're missing about 2 to 3/10 to the top teams. And there was also a different shape done to the start of those Venturi tunnels. The team decided to actually switch the floor out on Saturday because they saw the rain was coming. They wanted to keep the floor. And Toto Wolff has now confirmed that he says the floor wasn't actually the problem. It was something that they mechanically set up in the car. They changed a lot of the car on Saturday and had a pretty good qualifying. And if Lewis really put everything together, he could have been on provisional pole position. Nobody was catching Max in those rainy conditions. But starting in P3 was a great position for Lewis, and then we had George all the way down in P7, but because of Max's penalty, that moved him up to P6. Fast forward to our race day on Sunday, and we go to the formation lap, which shows us which drivers have started on which tires. From the top four teams, everybody started on mediums with the exception of Carlos, who decided to take a hard for the race. In hindsight, this didn't look like a great strategy, but if Ferrari provided the right calls, this could have actually resulted in a way bigger position than they ended up finishing with. We go into turn 1, and as you know, Spa in turn 1 can be very difficult with a lot of crashes throughout the years. Lewis gets a great run up on Checo and ends up getting P2. It takes a little bit on that straight going into Arouge and Radion, but Lewis does end up making the overtake, solidifying himself in P2 right behind Leclerc. Max ends up making some good positions in the beginning, gets himself ahead of Albon, and starts catching the people in front. On lap 3 is where we had Lewis pull off a stunning overtake on the Kemmel Straight, which ends up making him lead the race, and I can confidently say Lewis was pretty much the fastest driver here, but a decision was what mattered at the very end. This then gave us a race classification of Lewis in P1, Leclerc closely behind with only a second gap. Perez was holding on to P3, Piastri was very close behind catching Checo, and George was now in P5, having a pretty decent start and signs on the hard tires. In P6. From lap 4 to 10, Max was catching up to Lando, and obviously there is somewhat of a championship going on, so this was very important for us to watch and see if Max could actually make the overtake. But in fact he couldn't, and it was a very difficult time because the McLaren had the straight line speed, while the Red Bull was super strong in Sector 2 due to the downforce they had on the car. So with that being said, on lap 11, they go for the undercut and Max goes into the pits, bringing him back out on track in P14. Race leader Lewis comes in, we see Checo come in, and so does Oscar. So all of them pit on lap 12 to go for a potential two-stop strategy. In the meantime, what wasn't talked about was that George pit on lap 10. This will be very important to talk about because the guy pulled off a madness. On lap 13, even with the huge undercut George did, Oscar ends up overtaking him back on the straight, and then a lap later on 14 ends up taking Checo, so Oscar definitely had the pace to go after the front runners, which we will talk about as well. Lando stayed out another 6 laps when other cars were choosing to go for the two-stop strategy, so we assumed that McLaren was pulling something different. They've been trying to run this strategy of extending the tires and then letting Lando push. They did end up going for that here. It wasn't a great result as they were not able to catch Max at any point. They were behind him, but because of Max's advantage in Sector 2, it gave him enough of a gap in Sector 3 and 1 to be able to keep Lando behind. And with a couple of lockups and faults of Lando, who really needs to work on his starts because clearly he's been lacking in that avenue. It cost him the race here, at least going behind Max, but the McLaren team should have had a better strategy. Lap 17, we actually had Carlos leading because he ended up staying on the hards for a longer period of time. Lewis was P2. As I said, he was having an exceptional race. Leclerc was also somebody to talk about with a great race. Oscar not too far behind them. We got Checo, Russell. Max is not too far off of the front runners. There is potential for him to catch them. Finally, on lap 20, Carlos goes into the pits, which now we can assume might be a one-stop considering what Carlos was doing, but that wasn't the end result. Russell does on lap 21 pick off Checo to go into P4, which gives him a bit of clean air, and this really helps out the strategy. Laps 26 and 27 are super important because both Leclerc and Lewis decide to pit, with Leclerc trying to go for the overcut on lap 27. He had a slow pit stop, didn't help him out, but Lewis was in the provisional position of winning. Oscar then also pits very late into the race on lap 31, giving him 13 laps to really push out these hards that really haven't been deteriorating like how we thought they would. So this gives us a race classification on lap 32 of George in first, then Lewis, Leclerc, Piastri, and Verstappen. 7-second gap to George. He's pretty much told the team he wants to stick out on the one-stop strategy. Will he make it work? Piastri gets ahead of Leclerc on lap 36, and this is the moment where he can now push very hard to try and catch the Mercedes cars. On lap 38, this is where it gets very tasty for us enjoyers. Russell in P1, Lewis in P2, and Piastri in P3, only a 5.5 second gap between the three of these cars. By lap 41, Lewis is right on George's tail, and it seems like at this point, Lewis will make the overtake. They're allowed to fight, which I like the call by Mercedes because it was a brilliant call by George. But with the tire gap, this should be a pretty easy advantage for Lewis. Lap 42, 43, and 44, George successfully defended off Lewis in all of these laps. He had the better exits out of turn 1 and into the last bus stop chicane. Ended up having a great exit going into the start-finish line, which then ended up resulting in another good exit into turn 1. And then on the straight, it was always a 6 to 7 tenths gap that Lewis was not able to actually overcome, and George was perfectly managing the race. He ended up going on these tires for 34 laps. He now takes the name the Tire Whisperer on a track that has pretty much 5 out of 5 tire stress, and it's very rare we see a strategy like this, even with the pit stop being super long. Last year we saw a soft, medium, soft, and that was the tires being shred up like crazy. This year, there were 2 drivers that did a one-stop, and I got to shout out, obviously, Fernando Alonso, who got P9, and George Russell was another one of these drivers that did a one-stop, but it has now came out that he is disqualified from the Belgian 2024 GP. It was such a bold move, and it really shocked all the teams to stick out on a one-stop, specifically on the Spa track, with the FIA checking the car and multiple Mercedes members going to try and make their claim as to why the car isn't illegal and George shouldn't be disqualified. It seems like the results have came in, and there is a reason as to why this happened. Basically, the car was found to be 796.5 kilograms when the weight limit for a car at the end of a GP should always be at least 798 or more. Such a difference makes about 0.05 per lap. It's not a huge amount, but it does make a difference. And over a lap time, if you think about it, it's about 2 seconds, and George did win the race by about 5 tenths, and Piastri was not too far behind. Now, obviously, this wasn't done deliberately. This could be a combination of not having enough fuel in the car by the end of the race, as well as the hard tires just deteriorating from too much pace and being in clean air as much as George Russell was. This does take away his position, and now Lewis is the winner of the Belgian GP. He had an outstanding race, and I definitely feel happy for Lewis, but I do feel sad for George that this unfortunate circumstance happened. While I do understand the disqualification and how this works, it's kind of similar to what happened to Leclerc and Lewis. For them, it was more of the plank wear, which this is also a possibility that the plank wore down enough to a point that the car is now under the weight limit. It sucks that it happened to George after having probably what I would say the performance of his life, and it will come to him again, just a very unfortunate circumstance, and sometimes not a very lovely thing to our sports when the race can end, but we don't really know the winner. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.